And over to you, Ellie.
Okay, thank you very much. Hopefully my share screen will work with a little bit of fun before we started. You might just see it black for a little while whilst my internet kicks in. So firstly, thank you very much for inviting us on to speak and for coming to hear us as well. It's really nice to talk to you all. And so my PhD, as Damien says, is on dormouse and forest management, but the first part of it has been to look at the population status. And so my PhD has been funded by the Natural Environment Research Council, but also partnered with Forest Research and Natural England as well. And so I'm going to talk you through today the dormouse population trend, and then looking at how we apply that to the IUCN Red List as well. But first, just a little bit of background about dormouse conservation more generally. So dormice are highly protected species in the UK and EU legislation, and have been subject to several conservation initiatives in the UK, including a reintroduction programme, as we were hearing about at the start from Dot. However, dormice are still declining in the UK, and the latest population estimates suggest that they have declined by 72% between 1993 and 2014. And this follows a decline in both the range and the population size that has been documented since the early 20th century. So really, as far as our scientific records are aware, dormice have been declining for a very long time. And it's important that we keep monitoring the dormouse population to observe whether this decline continues, which might indicate that perhaps more conservation work is needed, or to see if it begins to level off or even improve, which suggests that our current conservation would be enough. Given that the public awareness of dormice, the high level of protection that they receive, and the work of organisations like People's Trust for Endangered Species, I would hope to see that at least a slowing in the rate of the population decline of dormice. And so the first part of my PhD has been to update this population status as a sort of basis for then looking into more forest management things later. So I've been able to do this because the UK has a lot of data on dormice, and dormice are primarily monitored in the UK through a citizen science project called the National Dormouse Monitoring Programme, which I'm sure some of you are very familiar with. And this programme is run by the People's Trust for Endangered Species. So it consists of sites across England and Wales where you have a grid of nest boxes, which are very much similar to bird boxes, but where the hole faces the trunk of the tree, which is much easier for the dormice to get into. And volunteers with dormouse licenses check the nest boxes once a month during the active season in May to October. So dormice always hibernate in the UK in the unactive season, and they hibernate on the ground, so they don't use these nest boxes during hibernation. So we're only really checking them during the active season. And if any dormice are found, so as you can see, this is a picture of a dormouse in a box in its little nest. We weigh, sex and age the dormice as well. So there's been a massive expansion in the number of sites and volunteers that partake in this volunteer programme. So when it started in 1988, there were only 5 sites, but as of 2019, there are 347 sites across the UK. So this makes the programme incredibly extensive in both space and time, and it's really a fantastic data set to inform dormouse population change. So this is certainly the best monitoring programme for dormice in the world, but it's probably one of the better ones for any species globally, just because of the effort and the number of sites that are involved in it. So the method for my analysis was originally completed by Dr. Cecily Goodwin, who was a previous student in my research group. And she analysed the data up to 2014 and then published this paper in 2017. And so I'm working with her and all of the co-authors of this paper to update the analysis with the most recent data set and to extend it slightly as well. So to go a little bit further into the population status. So this is the first graph from my PhD. And this is the population trend over time. So we have a year across the bottom here, and on the y-axis we have the relative difference in dormouse numbers. So we've set, just arbitrarily, the dormouse numbers in 1994 to 1, and then
Sorry,
all
Ellie,
other years
your
on relative.
graph hasn't actually come through yet.
Ah, annoying. Hopefully that's just a little blip on the Wi-Fi and it will be with you in a second.
There it is.
Perfect. So we have across the x-axis year, and on the y-axis here we have the relative difference in dormouse numbers. So you can see in 1994 I've set the value just to 1, just as a sort of arbitrary value. And then all of the other values in the other years are related back to that one. So when we get to 0.9, that means it's 90% of the dormice that were around in 1994. And here in black we have the trend with the confidence interval, 95% confidence interval in grey around it. So unfortunately you can see from this graph that there's been a pretty steady decline throughout the whole of these last 25 years. And the overall decline now stands at 76% between 1994 and 2018. The decline has also continued since the last analysis. So if you look at the other end of the graph, since 2014, the last analysis, in these last 4 years, there's been a decline of 15%. So now that we have the population decline, and we can see the population is still declining, we can also have a look at the IUCN status for dormice. So hopefully it will slide more appropriately. So just to detour quickly, I'm going to talk you through the IUCN criteria as they apply to population declines and dormice in this case. So the IUCN criteria can be used for a whole species, so a whole global range of dormice, but they can also be applied to regions. And that's particularly important in the UK because we are an island. There's no dormice that can come in and help our population if they're declining. If we lose our dormice, that's it. So it's very important that we consider this in the UK. The IUCN criteria have a section based on the decline of the population over 10 years. And that's because dormice are a very short-lived species, and 10-year period is the shortest one the IUCN use. And you have 2 thresholds to measure against. And for dormice, I'm interested in the category where the reductions or its causes may not have ceased, or may not be understood, or may not be reversible. So I will talk a little bit at the end of this presentation about some of the threats for dormice, but all of them haven't ceased. Several of them aren't really reversible, and we're not even sure if that's all of them. So really this is the best category for dormice. So that means I'm measuring the population change against these categories, and that means if I detect a 30% decline in 10 years, they would class as vulnerable. If I detect an over 50% decline, they would be endangered. And if I detect an over 80% decline in 10 years, they would be critically endangered. So to have a look at this for the dormouse population, I then split the population decline into these 10-year sliding windows. So we start with 10 years in 1994 to 2003 at the beginning, and increase by 1 year to 1995 to 2004. And so on and so forth until we get to the last window, which is 2009 to 2018. And this graph has the estimates as these dots. That's the main one that we're interested in, with the error bars representing the 95% confidence interval. And finally, on this graph, I've indicated where the vulnerable and endangered thresholds are, so the 50 and 30% decline. So there's a couple of interesting things to note on this graph. The first is that the trend varies a lot depending on which 10-year period you're looking at. So we have a lot of little wiggly curve of variation. And that's interesting as it matters then at which time point you are actually assessing the population status, as the conclusion might be quite different. So the IUCN says that we are to use, oh, my apologies, skipping ahead of myself. The IUCN says we are to use the most recent periods, which in this case are the periods of the greatest decline. So you can see these ones are the lowest and they are the closest to this 50% threshold as well. And so that suggests that the population decline has been accelerating over time. So it's actually been getting worse rather than better as the declines are getting greater in these recent periods. And finally, to consider the IUCN category, you can see, as I said, that these latest windows are getting really close to the endangered category. This one here is about 48% decline in 10 years. But they haven't quite crossed over that threshold into endangered. So based on this alone, I couldn't categorise, well, not me myself, the IUCN wouldn't categorise dormice as endangered. And from this model, we can also have a look at some site-specific population indices. So these give us a bit more of an idea of the pattern of decline, so we can begin to see if all of the sites are declining or perhaps some sites are doing well and that sort of thing. And so I calculated site-specific population indices for any site that had been surveyed for more than 2 years. So that means that we can actually draw a trend over the time of the site, and that they had detected at least one dormouse in the course of the surveying, as we need dormice to be able to detect the dormouse trend. I've been able to calculate 2 indices. The first is a trend index. So this indicates the trend over the whole 25-year period. So it basically says if the site on average has an increasing, stable or decreasing population. So quite a coarse look at what's going on in the population trend at each site. I also have an abundance index, which indicates the relative average population size in the same period. And that one, again, is quite coarse. It's more sort of small, medium, large, that sort of thing. So we can look at these indices across the whole of the UK. So this is the entirety of England and Wales, which is the range of the dormouse currently. And these indicate all of the sites that I've calculated these indices for. So the colour and the shape of the symbol represent the trend index. So a green upwards arrow indicates an increase in population. Yellow circles are stable populations, and downwards red triangles are decreasing populations. And then the symbol size is based on the abundance index. So the smallest symbols have the smallest populations. So right down in the bottom of the graph in Cornwall/Devon, we have a small population that's decreasing next to a larger population that's decreasing. And then further in the middle of the country, we have quite a small increasing population. And over here, we have a bigger increasing population, and so on. So as expected from the population trend, the majority of the sites have decreasing population. So there's a lot of red triangles in this graph or this map. But you can also see that quite a fair few of sites are stable or increasing, and there's no particular pattern that my eye can pick out on this map. The different kinds of trends are split up quite well across the country. And so there's a lot of site-specific variation in dormouse populations, and that suggests that local conditions have a really big impact on the outcomes for dormice. So if we can find out what makes the sites increase, what part of the habitat or the management or even the climate is making those sites increase, we might be able to apply that to other sites and hopefully turn those red triangles into green ones. We can also have a look on a much closer scale, so you can zoom right into specific sites. So I'm sure you'll recognise this is Berkshire in the middle with the surrounding counties. And you can see that Berkshire has the same mix of sites as across the country. You have a small population that's increasing, a large population that's increasing, a couple of decreasing, stable. And so it's very representative of the rest of the country. So these site-specific indices also made me think about what other differences between sites that we can see in this data. So I noticed quite often that dormice would disappear from a site and then eventually the site stops being surveyed. Or sometimes the dormice just disappear for a couple of years and then they come back. So I had a look at the proportion of sites that didn't record any adult dormice that year. And just wondered if there was some sort of trend in that. And this is the trend line fitted here with the black, again, with the 95% confidence interval in grey. And this trend gives a significant increase. So over time, we're seeing a much greater proportion of sites do not have any evidence of dormice on them in that particular year. And so we're getting up to about 30% of sites or between 25 and 30% of sites don't have any evidence of dormice in the most recent period. And so that suggests that there's been a loss of sites over time. It doesn't necessarily say anything about the range, because I haven't managed to look at whether the sites are being lost on the very edges of their range or if they're being lost in the centre. It does suggest there's a loss of occupancy, which might just be due to there's not enough dormice, there aren't as many dormice as there were. The data also allow me to have a look into breeding a bit more. So when you do the dormouse checks, you note down the number of young in different age categories. And this allowed me to look at whether or not there was evidence for breeding on a site. So just looking at presence and absence of litters or young. I could then calculate the proportion of active sites, so those sites with adult dormice present that didn't have evidence of breeding. So that percentage is shown on the y-axis here, and that basically shows where breeding hasn't happened, but there has been an opportunity to breed. And I found when I fitted this trend, which is again the black line with the confidence interval in grey, this was also a significant increase in the proportion of sites that didn't have breeding. And you can see that we're getting to be some particularly big proportions recently. This is nearly 60% of sites without any evidence of breeding. And so that suggests that there's been a reduction in the breeding of dormice over time as well, which might be related. It could be a cause or a consequence of their population decline. So I've been through quite a few graphs quite relatively quickly. So just to recap everything I've gone over so far. The dormice are declining in the UK, and my latest estimates suggest they are declining by 76% between 1994 and 2018. It also seems that the decline is increasing, so it's accelerating over time, but it's not yet quite past that 50% in 10 years that would be needed to classify them as endangered. We also have an increase in the proportion of sites without any dormice in this data, and also a reduction in breeding over time. So all of this data together, all of this evidence that I have, suggests that the dormouse population is not wonderfully healthy in the UK. And this, coupled in particular with the fact that we know there's been a chronic, long-term decline since 1994, that is well documented in the data. All of that evidence leads me to conclude that they could be considered endangered in the UK, despite what the IUCN say. And that might seem like quite a small point. Dormice are currently considered vulnerable in the UK, so it would only be an increase of 1 threat level. But I do think that listing them as endangered would raise the public awareness more and might encourage some further conservation action to reverse their declines. So now that we know that the dormice are declining, I also wanted to talk through some of their threats or some of the reasons why they might be declining. So the first factor is habitat, in particular fragmentation and degradation of their habitat. So dormice are specialists on young woodland with a high diversity of tree species and a really dense understory. And all of those factors provide enough food for them. So dormice only eat really flowers and seeds and insects. So they need plants to flower and seed all the way through the year for them to have enough food. And that requires a different combination of species. And then the really dense understory is important for them to be able to move around because they are almost 100% arboreal. They really hate being on the ground. And so a dense understory just gives them lots of little pathways that they can move through the woodland. So the UK in general has lost a lot of woodland cover due to clearing, which has caused a lot of woodland fragmentation. There's also been a loss of young woodland in particular because of a reduction in traditional management techniques. So instead, our landscapes tend to have older, single-age, low-diversity plantations, which aren't as good for dormice. They can certainly survive there, but they wouldn't necessarily be as favoured. And though there's been a lot of effort to restart traditional woodland management, such as coppicing, for conservation purposes, I'm not sure it's quite at a large enough scale to have positively impacted the population as a whole. So it's certainly something that should be continued, but I think it's something that's going to have to be increased quite a lot to have an effect. The second factor is our climate. So dormice require cold, dry winters to hibernate successfully, and then warm, sunny summers to get enough food to breed successfully. And really, we seem to be getting less and less of this type of data in the UK because of climate change. And in particular, climate change appears to be making our climate a lot wetter. So we tend to get more rain both in the summer and the winter. That's particularly bad for dormice because their fur isn't actually waterproof like other mammal species. So if they get wet during hibernation, they will lose a lot of energy because of the way water evaporates and removes heat from them. And if it's raining in the summer, they're just very unlikely to go outside and they will miss out on foraging opportunity. And one of the reasons that climate is important is it might make dormice more likely to go into torpor, which might then affect their breeding, some other aspects of their life history as well. And so this is something that Charlotte has been looking into further as it relates so clearly to climate change. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to her and just thank you very much for listening to my half of the talk. So thank you. And I will pass over to Charlotte.
Wrong button. Right, can everyone see my screen now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry.
So yeah, I'm Charlotte and I'm in my second year of my PhD now. I started just over a year ago. And as Damien said at the beginning, I'm looking at sort of dormice at the edge of their range and sort of in marginal habitats and how these populations might be affected by climate change across the UK. I've always had an interest in dormice. I was a volunteer on the 2017 reintroduction in Warwickshire, and I was also a member of the Nottinghamshire Dormouse group when I worked up there. So when I saw this PhD advertised, I couldn't help but apply. But prior to that, I worked for the Woodland Trust for around 3 years, working on various citizen science projects for them. And my PhD is funded by Energy Renewables Company, and I'll just go on to explain a bit about why they're funding this PhD. So my main study site is Clonigog up in North Wales, and it's actually a site, you can see sort of on the map here where it's located up in North Wales. It's owned by Natural Resource Wales, and it's actually a conifer plantation that was planted around 80 years ago. And the reason Energy are involved is they wanted to build a wind turbine on site. And so they went through the various sort of mitigation legislation. And as part of that, they had to sort of look for dormice. Because it's a conifer plantation, no one thought they'd find any there. So they set up all these boxes thinking we won't find any dormice because, you know, they don't really like conifer plantations in theory. They like broadleaf forests. But much to everyone's surprise, dormice a couple of seasons in started turning up in these in the nest boxes, and no one's really sure how they got there, because sometimes you'll find dormice in conifer plantations if it used to be an ancient woodland, but as I say, this is a brand new conifer plantation that was planted up 80 years ago, so there wouldn't be any sort of remnant populations from an ancient woodland site, and the nearest known population is a good couple of kilometres away. So it's a bit of a mystery how they're there. And then this led Energy to sort of, as part of the habitat mitigation for building the wind turbine site, said they'd fund a PhD researcher to sort of look into what's happening. And yeah, that's where I come in. So some dormice monitoring has been going on the site. So I hope everyone can see, this map. Just to give you sort of an idea of scale on the site, up here in the north in the boxes in the north, up to the south takes about 20 minutes in the car. So it's a big old site. And they did some monitoring from 2009 to 2014 when they were sort of before the wind turbines were built to try and establish where populations were. And now they've sort of got an idea of where the dormice are. They've sort of cut the monitoring right back for the last few years, and there's now down to about 140 boxes across the site, and they're monitoring for various different reasons. So sort of the orange dots you can see on the map are where there are nest box present, but no dormice have been found for the last few years. and the stars represent boxes where dormice have been found for the last few years. So there's sort of these strongholds of populations up in the north and the south of the site, and they're just being monitored to sort of see how they're doing. And then you've got these blue hatched areas, which are the dormouse mitigation areas. So they're going to be subject to habitat management in the next few years, where they're going to thin out the conifer and plant up shrub species that dormice will like. As Ellie said in her talk, you know, shrub species such as hawthorn and dog rose and things that will provide a food source for them. So as you can see in this area, there's sort of all these orange dots where no dormice are being found, but hopefully when the mitigation takes place and this conifer thinning happens, then we might see some dormice moving into these boxes and into these areas as they become more suitable for them. There's also this row of boxes up here, which is set up to sort of investigate the effects of nearby tree felling on populations as well. So sort of various different things going on the site. And although I haven't been able to go up to site half as much as I'd like because of COVID, sort of a year into my PhD, I've managed to go about 2 or 3 times, I think. But I did manage to go up there last July to sort of do their summer box checks. And out of the 20 individual animals I found on that check, 11 of them were torpid. And just to give you sort of an idea of how many adults that was, out of the nine animals that were active, 6 were from the same box and 4 of those were young. So that just gives you an idea of sort of the high proportion of animals I found torpid last July. And sort of as I walked around and I kept finding these animals asleep. So for those that I'm sure everyone knows, but torpor is sort of like a mini hibernation. So in the winter they'll go into hibernation and that's their main sleep. But sometimes in the summer they'll go into these mini sort of hibernations, but where, yeah, as you can see, I'm just holding them in my hand, they are fast asleep. And I thought to myself, well, this is a bit strange as it's July. You'd think it would be their active season. You think they'd be busy breeding. But I found all these animals sort of fast asleep, which then led me to sort of investigate further why they might be in torpor in the middle of July. So as Ellie said, the National Dormouse Monitoring Programme dataset is a really great dataset and we're really lucky to have it. And this allowed me to start investigating some of the drivers of why dormice might be going into torpor in the active season. So I started by focusing on the condition of the animals. So for most of the animals recorded, we've got their weights. So I split out those individuals found in the summer months, so June, July and August, and those found in the autumn, so September, October, November. So as you can see from this graph, in the summer, the mean temperature of animals found in torpor, so this box plot here, the mean weight is lower than those that are found that are active. And then you can see in the autumn months this shifts. So those found in torpor tend to have a higher weight than those that are active. Now, I think this is probably because in the summer, those individuals that sort of weigh a bit less aren't at their optimum weight. They'll probably go into torpor to conserve energy because they aren't as sort of at a good as condition. So they won't waste energy by going out to forage. They can just sort of go into torpor. Whereas sort of the opposite is probably happening in the autumn. They're getting ready to hibernate. Those that have reached their optimum weight to go into hibernation don't need to bother wasting energy going out and foraging anymore, and they can go into torpor instead and just sort of wait to get ready for hibernation. So after I'd looked at the condition of the animals, I decided to start looking at the climate of the sites to see whether that might affect whether animals are going into torpor or not. So looking at sort of annual averages for temperature and rainfall, I assigned each of the sites in the Dormouse Monitoring Programme as either cold or warm and dry or wet. So on these graphs, these are the proportion of animals found, and the blue area are animals that are found in torpor, and the red areas are the animals that are found active. And as you can see here, sort of animals found in torpor on cold sites there are a higher proportion of animals found torpid than when compared to the warmer sites. And the same thing can be seen here. When you compare the wet sites, there's more animals found in torpor than there are on the dry sites. And I did a statistical test on both of these, so cold versus warm and dry versus wet. And these differences in proportions both came out as statistically significant. So from this, I knew sort of condition of the animal was affecting whether they were going into torpor, as was the climate of the site. So this sort of preliminary information allowed me to then go on and start to build some predictive models. So please excuse these messy graphs, but each of the coloured lines in both of these graphs represent a month. You've then got males on the left-hand side and females on the right, and the different lines represent the percentage likelihood that an animal will be torpid based on its weight across the various months. And I think sort of for me, the most interesting part of these graphs from when I ran the model was the difference in the summer months. So July, the purple line, and August, the orange line. So when we look at the females for August, you can see sort of if they're very light, there's sort of a 25% chance they'll go into torpor, but this drops off very quickly. And by the time you get to sort of 25 grams in August, there's almost no chance that the females will be in torpor. Now, when you compare this to the males, there's still quite a low chance they'll be in torpor, less than 25%, and it does slightly decrease as they get heavier, but it's nothing like sort of getting down to near zero like with the females. And the same when you compare the July line, there's a much steeper drop for the females than when you compare this with the males. And I need to do some more analysis on this, but sort of common sense tells me this is probably because the females are breeding and rearing young in the summer. So obviously if they've got young to feed, they can't go into torpor, whereas the males, if they're not rearing young, they can probably afford to go into torpor slightly more in the summer if they need to. So because I could see this difference between the males and the females, this then led me to sort of investigate what was happening in each specific box where torpid animals were found. So I'm lucky that in the data set, all the boxes are labelled along with the site. So then I could sort of split out exactly what was happening in each box on each check. So I started by assigning each box as either a breeding box or not. So I did this by, if young were found, then I classed it as a breeding box, and if young weren't found, then it wasn't. And actually, when I put that into the model, it came out as sort of highly significant. And if it is a breeding box, then the likelihood of torpor drops down to about 8%. So yeah, if there's young in the box, then the adults found within that box are not likely to be in torpor. And again, that makes sense. If there's adults in there busy rearing the young, then they can't really afford to go to sleep. I then also looked at sort of the number of adults that are found in the box. And this is if there's sort of no young. So whether there's 2, 3, 4 or 5 adults or just one. And again, this came out as highly significant. And as the number of adults increase in the box, then the likelihood of being torpid decreases. And I need to do some more analysis on this, but I think that's probably because the more adults you have, they can probably thermoregulate a bit better, share each other's sort of body warmth, and therefore they've got less reason to go into torpor as well if there's more adults found within the box. And then climate. So I now have some, from when I first started, I now have some more sort of detailed climate data. So I've got seasonal, monthly, weekly and daily minimum temperature and rainfall for each of the sites in the National Dormouse Monitoring Programme. And I've been sort of playing around with these and sort of plugging different combinations into my model to see sort of what comes out as being the best predictor of torpor. And at the moment, daily minimum temperature on the day of the box check comes out as highly significant. So the colder it is on the day of the box check, the more likely that animals are to be torpid. And actually weekly rainfall comes out as a bigger predictor than daily rainfall. So if it's been a particularly wet week, then animals found on a box check are more likely to be torpid as well. And what I'm hoping to do with this sort of in the next couple of months as well is sort of compare what's happening on a daily basis to what's happening on a seasonal basis. So if it's been a particularly cold or warm season, spring or summer, will this affect dormice differently on the daily basis? So will dormice that have experienced a hot spring behave differently day to day than those that have experienced a cold one? And that's going to sort of take a bit more analysis and sort of playing around with the model. But yeah, I'm hoping to do that quite soon. And the other thing I've looked at as well is time of day that the box check happens. So I've got sort of a smaller subset of data that has time attached to when the animal was found in the box. And checking the boxes in the morning when compared to the afternoon has come out as highly significant as well. So if you check the box in the morning, animals are more likely to be torpid than if the box is checked in the afternoon. And I think this is probably again to do with temperature, because as it warms up during the day, animals are more likely to wake up. So sort of all of these various different factors that are driving animals into torpor has then led me to create a site index. And this is still quite early days and doesn't look nearly as pretty as Ellie's map, but these are all the sites on the National Dormouse Monitoring Programme and the probability that animals are going to be found in torpor at that site. So the dark red circles represent a site where animals are very likely to be torpid, and the lighter and white sites represent circles are sites where animals are less likely to be torpid. Now, again, you can't see sort of any great pattern. And this, again, is probably to do with site-to-site variation, but you can sort of see a cluster of sites, of whites and lighter sites in the southeast, which makes sense because it's slightly drier and warmer down in the southeast. So again, if climate's having a big impact on whether they're driven into torpor, this makes sense. And then you've got these outliers here in the north that are all dark red, so animals are highly likely to be torpid. And again, based on climate, this sort of makes sense as it's colder in the north of England. But yeah, so I'm hoping to sort of build on this site index and then to be able to sort of give a wider picture of whether animals are more or less likely to be driven into torpor on particular sites. And then I'm also looking at individual level data. So this is data where individual dormice have been marked, and then you can follow individuals through a data set over time to see how they're behaving. So at the moment, I just have some data from a site in Lithuania. It's about 20 years worth of data, and there's sort of over 1,000 individuals have been sort of marked, and yeah, you can follow them through. And I hope in time to sort of get some of the data from the UK populations that have been picked out as well. And this is very early days, but what I'm hoping to investigate is whether if an animal goes into torpor during the active season, whether it's more or less likely to survive to the following season, and whether it's more or less likely to breed in that season. So my hypothesis at the moment is that if they go into torpor, this is probably an energy saving exercise, so they probably would be more likely to survive to the next season. But if they're torpid during the active season, then this might decrease their ability to breed. So, as I say, this sort of section of my analysis is still very early days, but what I have been able to find from the Lithuania data so far, from quite a simple model, is that yes, like ours, lighter animals are more likely to go into torpor. So this red line represents the lightest individuals, and this dark green line represents the heaviest. And as you can see, the red ones are more likely to go into torpor, but also the age of the animal. As the animals get older, they are also more likely to be found in torpor during the active season, which I thought was really interesting, and actually is only something you can find out if individuals are marked. So just sort of shows a really interesting thing you can do when you've got marked individuals. So yeah, as I say, I'm hoping to build on this. So in terms of sort of next steps with this particular part of my research, as I say, I'm trying to sort of fully incorporate climate into the model so we can understand that a bit better and how that's affecting dormice. And I also want to build on the site index, and then when that's finished, compare it to the map Ellie showed earlier with the trends of dormice and whether there's any correlation between sort of torpor and the sites that are increasing, decreasing, or stable. And yeah, it might be a case of sites that have really high incidences of torpor may have lower breeding rates. That sort of remains to be seen, but that's something I'm sort of hope that might come out of the data. And then in terms of the rest of my research, so I hope sort of COVID allowing, I might be able to get out into the field a bit more this year and next. And one of the ideas I'm toying with is looking at the length of time that dormice go into torpor. So at the moment, we just have this small snapshot of when a box is checked on sort of a monthly or a seasonal basis, and we know they're in torpor for that particular day when the box is checked. But we don't know how long this torpor lasts for, whether it's minutes, hours, or days. So I'd quite like to investigate that a bit further and see whether sort of what length of torpor is driven by. Another one of my data chapters is also going to be looking at dormice phenology. So this is sort of the timing of their breeding and how that varies year on year. So I've been able to show sort of through preliminary analysis that there are good and bad years for dormouse breeding. And at the moment, it's looking like these correspond to early and late breeding. So in years when there's dormice start breeding earlier, then that's a better year for sort of production of young. And years where they start breeding later, that they produce less young, which makes sense, right? But I'd like to look at some of the drivers of why some years they breed particularly early and some years they breed particularly late, and how this might be related to climate change as well. So under future climate scenarios, will we see that there are more sort of bad years for breeding versus good years for dormice? So that's everything from me. Just thanks very much for inviting us to talk, and if anyone has any questions.
Well, thank you very much for that. Sorry, Ellie and Charlotte, that was very interesting. So if anyone does have any questions, if you'd like to just either raise your hand or there's a raise hand icon within Teams. Failing that, just turn your video on and wave at me frantically until I do. Nope. Dot.
Hi there. Yeah, really fascinating. Thanks for that. That was really good. What I found, Charlotte, obviously yours was much more thorough than my little study, but I found that particularly later on, the late litters, if the female got put on significant amount of weight and the temperature dropped below 10 degrees for several nights, then she went into torpor even if she was feeding young, and the young would then die even if they were just about to come out of the nest. If they had their eyes open, they were just about ready to come out. That happened a couple of times with me. So that was quite interesting. Yeah, but yours was fascinating. Thanks very much for that.
Yeah, that just sort of goes back to that sort of what I'm hoping to show with the survival. I think those females had obviously decided to go into torpor to sort of save themselves at the price of their young, I imagine.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other thing for where would I just have a look for the first talk? Was it Ellie? First talk for Ellie.
Yeah.
You know, you said that they were suddenly disappearing. The dormice were disappearing. For Ellie's study.
Yeah.
Well, what John Prince found last year, that he works in Little Linford Wood. That's quite a famous dormouse site, and he did some the tunnel footprints, and he managed to get them high up in the canopy, and there were dormice going right up into the canopy where it wasn't possible to nest box them. And now the People's Trust have done a bridge from Little Linford Wood across the motorway, and I don't know what's happened about that. I don't know whether any have gone, but they certainly went quite high up, and that's why he thought that they were disappearing. So maybe it's the same with yours, I don't know.
That's the only sort of drawback of using the nest boxes, is it's not entirely clear how much of a dormouse population on the site is actually using the boxes. So we know, as I'm sure you will have seen when you did checks, that you sometimes get really old young. So you suddenly find juveniles in October when you've never seen any other young. So they must have bred somewhere else. And so certainly they probably are just up in the canopy where the nest boxes aren't.
Could be, yes. But anyway, brilliant studies. That's well done, both of you. Really good.
Thank you.
Okay.
So thanks for that, Dot. So Mike, you've got a question?
Yes, thanks, Damien. I'm a novice on this particular subject. Well, in fact, on lots of subjects, but this particular one. So these may be fairly basic questions. Ellie sort of half answered one of them, which was you're using nest boxes, obviously, because that's the most convenient way of finding out where they are and where they're breeding. But I'm just wondering, to what extent are nest boxes becoming a key factor in, if you like, the lives of the dormice? They're coming to depend on that. And the second one, because Damien knows Brian Cluse has been doing a study in one of our woods in Cookham in Berkshire, and where I don't think we've actually identified anything yet. I mean, I'm just wondering to what distance will they travel from an area where they are breeding to a piece of woodland where they're not, if that makes sense.
So the first part of your question, how reliant they are on nest boxes, there's certainly been some studies by some of the guys in Lithuania where they found that nest boxes at the density that the UK has them, so the UK tends to put them within, I want to say 25 to 50 metres of each other. And when you have nest boxes like that, it can increase the carry capacity of the wood, so you do find more dormice in the area. So it does suggest that they do benefit from the nest boxes, and it does affect the population. And the thought is that they're reliant on the nest boxes because they don't have as many holes in trees that you would expect them to have in ancient woodlands.
Sure.
We just don't have the veteran trees that we used to have, basically. So we don't have the holes. And they really do like using the nest boxes where they can. So they definitely do have an effect. In terms of distance from breeding to non-breeding, dormice do not move particularly far. They're really actually quite bad dispersers, especially as they have to rely on arboreal routes. So they're going to prefer to move through hedgerows or woodlands, which does make it quite difficult. I can't remember what the numbers are off the top of my head, I have to say, but it will be a couple of 100 metres, I think, at most, that they will move within to disperse from their sort of where they're born to where they then decide to breed. So they're from their natal territory to their existing territory is only going to be a few 100 metres. So this is the other problem with dormice in terms of their population. They've lost range. We know we've lost them from sites in the north, and they just can't move fast enough to recolonise those sites as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for that. Silas, I believe you got a question you typed in the chat. Would you like to unmute and ask it?
Hi, thanks, Damien. I just wondered, I know that spring's arriving a little bit earlier every year, and I know it's just a few weeks, but have you noticed any difference, like marked difference in their behaviour?
So I've started some preliminary work on this, and I'm actually hoping to use Nature's Calendar data, which is a citizen science project at the Woodland Trust, if anyone's heard of it, looking at sort of biological events for all kinds of things, for sort of first flowering of trees, first leaf, and they have sort of over 70 species and events on there for biological timing, so you can sort of see whether it's a particularly early or late year, and you can sort of, from that data set, you can also see that spring is getting earlier. And when I was looking at this sort of back before Christmas, I could see that the dormice breeding and when they're earlier does correspond with the phenology of other things. So like particularly it corresponded with rowan budburst, for example, and other sort of events like that. So they do seem to be mirroring what's happening with other species across the UK with regards to spring and their breeding, which is good that they're breeding when there is a food source, I suppose. But yeah, that's sort of part of my PhD, sort of still very early days, but I'm hoping to show that they're sort of following the phenology, but that under climate change it might be that conditions get worse for them in terms of what they need to breed if it's getting sort of wetter and things.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that. Does anyone else have any other questions? So I've actually got one. The site where you're working, Charlotte, the map showed that there were some turbines what looked reasonably close. Have they had any effect at all that you've measured on or noticed on the dormice itself?
So monitoring hasn't really been going on long enough to know, because as I say, they weren't expecting at all to find any dormice there, and everyone sort of, when that first dormouse turned up in a box, I think everyone was a bit blown over. But that line I showed you that was quite close to all the turbines, and you know, when I've been to site, you do feel very close to them, and you can hear them whizzing around, and you think, God, that, you know, they're loud and they're close, but the dormice do seem to still be turning up in the boxes. So it's an interesting one. I'm not sure whether the turbines have had an effect on them, because obviously no one was expecting them to be there, but they're still turning up, not in massive numbers. I think last year there were 36. No, in 2019 there were 36 found across the boxes, and last year it was 24. But someone else in my Leo, who's another researcher here on dormice, he has a theory that in the conifer plantations they've got no reason to come down and use the boxes. He thinks they're probably high up in the canopy, and in a conifer plantation that's where their food source would be. So he thinks they might be doing better in conifers than we think, and they're just not using the boxes. So again, it's difficult to know.
Okay, thank you. Right, does anyone else have any other questions they'd like to ask? Well, so if we can all show our appreciation for Ellie and Charlotte, that was a fascinating talk. Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Stop recording.